Hello and good evening everyone, and welcome to the first part of our study of Plato's Republic, where today we'll be focusing on the introduction. And I've done a video previously explaining how this study of Plato's Republic will work and how we'll work our way through it. But for those who didn't see that video, I'll just speak quickly about it here. This is the Hackett edition of Plato's complete works, and that is the translation I've used for all of the other Platonic dialogues over on my other channel, Lewis Kirk. I've done most of them, so that's the source text I'll be using. But I've also got this lovely Penguin Classic edition of Plato's Republic, which gives a lot more context and summary remarks about each part of each book. So for the study, I'll be using them both. I'll be using the source text from Hackett, and I'll be adding additional information and context with the help of the Penguin Classic edition. And this evening, for the introduction, the Hackett Publishing only has a couple of pages. I think is a page and a half of text that I'll be reading, which will be how the live audio ebooks will be structured. And then I will change format, sit back and read all of the pages for the introduction in this book. So before we get into that, if you value what I'm doing here at Book Club, be sure to like this video and make sure you're subscribed. Comment in the top chat so I can say hello to everyone who comes in. And support me if you feel inclined. The best way and the easiest way would be to share this link, the URL to this video, share it on your social media so that other people can find it and come in. Or you can support me by becoming a Patreon at the Patreon Book Club community, where I've also developed a syllabus on PayPal. And another easy way is in the super chats. And so let's get straight into the Hackett Publishing edition of their introduction. Is only very short, and it will show you how the audio ebooks live will function. So I'll bring up the text now, I'll read these pages, and then I'll change format and I'll recline to read the Penguin Classic edition introduction. So let's go. This is the live audio ebooks, what it will look like when I'm reading Plato's Republic moving forward, all of the other books. And so let's read this. The Republic's ancient subtitle, On Justice, much understates the scope of the work. It begins as a discussion of the nature of justice, much in the manner of Socratic dialogues like Laches or Charmides, with Socrates examining and refuting successive views of his interlocutors on the subject. But in Book 2 he renews the inquiry, now agreeing to cease examining and refuting the opinions of others, and to present his own account. He will say what justice really is, and show that people who are truly and fully just thereby lead a happier, happier life than any unjust person could. The horizon lifts to reveal ever-expanding vistas of philosophy. Socrates presents his views on the original purposes for which political communities, cities were founded, the basic principles of just and social political organization, and the education of young people that those principles demand. Book 2, 3, and 5. He decides that a truly just society requires philosophic rulers, both men and women, living in a communistic guardhouse within the larger community. The needs for such rulers leads him on to wider topics. He discusses the variety and nature and proper regimentation of human desires, and the precise nature of justice and the other virtues, and of the corresponding vices, both in the individual person's psychology and in the organization of political society. 4, 8, and 9. He explains the nature of knowledge and its proper objects, 5 to 7, the world revealed by our senses, the world of everyday, traditional life, is, he argues, cognitively and metaphysically deficient. It depends upon a prior realm of separately existing forms, organized beneath the form of the good and graspable, not by our senses, but only through rigorous dialectical thought and discussion after preparation in extended mathematical studies. There is even a discussion of the basic principles of visual and literary art and art criticism, Book 10. All this is necessary, Socrates says, finally, to answer the basic question about justice, not what it is, but why it must make the just person live a good, happy life, and the unjust person a bad, miserable one. Speaking throughout to no identified person, that is, directly to the reader, Socrates relates a conversation he took part in one day in the Athenian port city of Piraeus. All the others present, a considerable company, represent historical personages. Among them were the noted sophist and teacher of oratory Thrasymachus, and Glaucon and Adamanthus, Plato's brother. Glaucon is an ambitious, energetic, manly young man, much interested in public affairs and drawn to the life of politics. An intelligent and argumentative person, he scorns ordinary pleasures and aspires to higher things. Always especially attracted by such people, it was with him that Socrates had gone down to Piraeus in the first place. Adamanthus, equally a decent young man, is less driven, less demanding of himself, more easily satisfied and less gifted in philosophical argument. After Book 1, Socrates carries on his discussion first with one, then with the other of these two men. The conversation as a whole aims at answering to their satisfaction the challenge they jointly raise against Socrates' conviction that justice is a preeminent good for the just person. But Socrates addresses different parts of his reply to a different one of them. To assist the reader, we have inserted the names of the speakers at the tops of the pages of the translation. Though in books 2 to 10, Socrates no longer searches for the truth by criticizing his interlocutor's ideas, he proceeds nonetheless in a spirit of exploration and discovery, proposing bold hypotheses and seeking their confirmation in the first instance through examining their consequences. He often emphasizes the tentativeness of his results and the need for a more extensive treatment. Quite different is the main speaker in the late dialogue Sophist, Statesman, Philebus and Laws, whether Socrates himself or a visitor from Elea or Athens. There we get confident, reasoned delivery of philosophical results, assumed by the speaker to be well established. So I will just rearrange myself here and get comfortable to read the Penguin Classic version. Bear with me. Hello. So that is what the majority or what all of the live audio ebooks will look like. And our study of Plato's Republic, like I say, hello there, Ariana. Nice to see you. Buenos tardes. And Baggage and Glitchage. I'm glad you could make a read. I hope your job's going well. And so what I just shared will be how the live reading of Plato's Republic will go. And I'll jump back like this every so often just to say hello and thank everyone for their super chats and just say hello. But because it's such a short introduction in the Hackett Publishing edition, I'm going to read a more in-depth and full introduction in this Penguin Classic version. And so that's what will be going on for the rest of this stream. So he begins with Plato's life and times. Plato was born in 427 BC, some 4 years after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War and just over a year after the death of Pericles. His father, Ariston, who died when Plato was a few years old, was a member of an old and distinguished Athenian family, as was also his mother, Perictione. Ariston and Perictione I think that's how you pronounce it, had two other sons, both older than Plato, Adamanthus and Glaucon, who are two of the main characters in the Republic. After Ariston's death, Perictione married again, as was the normal Greek custom, her second husband being Pyrilampes, a close friend and supporter of Pericles and himself, prominent in public life. Plato thus came of a distinguished family with many political connections. Through his stepfather he had a link with Pericles, who gave his name to the great age of Athenian history, and to whom Athenian democracy, as Plato knew it, owed many of its characteristic features. For, though Pericles is remembered chiefly for the personal ascendancy which dominated Athenian affairs for 30 years, he was nonetheless, in domestic politics, a democrat. On the other hand, two of Perictione's relations, her uncle Charmides, after whom one of Plato's early dialogues is called, and her cousin Critias, were prominent in the oligarchic movements at the end of the century. Of Plato's early years we know little. He presumably received the normal education of a Greek boy, learning to read and write and study the poets. More important, he grew up in a city at war. The Peloponnesian War, which began just before his birth, lasted until he was 23 and ended in defeat and humiliation for Athens and in the break-up of the confederation which he had led since the Persian Wars and which Pericles had consolidated and turned into something more like an empire than a confederation. Pericles himself died in 429 BC, a victim of the plague which visited Athens in the early years of the war and brought death and demoralization with it, and which is described with vivid detail by Thucydides. After Pericles' death, the more radical Democrats were the most influential force in Athenian politics. They were men of a very different kind. Their origins were comparatively humble. Cleon was a tanner, Hyperbolus a lamp seller. They relied for their power, as Pericles had done, on their ability to sway the popular assembly. But whereas in the judgment of Thucydides, which Plato echoes, he never sacrificed his independence, they felt themselves to be dependent on popular favour, and their policies were too often those which they thought the people would like, rather than those which the situation demanded. Thucydides had little cause to love them, but though they certainly did not lack energy or courage or ability, the judgment is not unfounded, and it was under their leadership that Athens finally lost the war. Their external policy is commonly called imperialist. They recognized more clearly than Pericles the element of force in the Athenian confederation, and they were prepared to use it more ruthlessly. They were ready to act on the belief which Thrasymachus expresses in Book 1 of the Republic, that it is natural and sensible for the strong to exploit the weak. The first stage of the war ended in a stalemate in 421 BC. A few years later, Athens embarked on a great expedition against Syracuse in Sicily, another step in the policy of expansion. The expedition was a disastrous failure, and by 412 BC the men, ships and money devoted to it were irretrievably lost. The strain of external disaster can sharpen internal conflict. There was constant opposition to the policies of the democratic leaders. To the better off, their external policy seemed folly, and their internal policy exploitation of the rich for the benefit of the irresponsible masses. The shock of the Sicilian disaster gave the opposition, the oligarchs, their chance, and in 411 BC there was a revolution in which control passed to a council of 400. This was succeeded a year later by the so-called Government of the 5,000, a constitution of which many moderates approved, and which consisted essentially in limiting acting citizens' right. And which consisted essentially in limiting active citizen rights to those able to equip themselves with arms. The Athenian hoplite or infantryman was expected to provide his own arms, who proved to number about 9,000, about a quarter to a third of the adult male population. The object was to keep political control in the hands of the more responsible elements in the population, but Athens depended on her sea power, and could not deprive her poorer citizens who served in the fleet of a say in her affairs. The government of the 5,000 only lasted a year. The democratic constitution was then restored, and savage measures were taken by the Democrats against their oligarchic opponents, so that the following 6 years have been described as a democratic terror. It was in this atmosphere of party bitterness that Plato reached his 18th year. The final downfall of Athens came in 404 BC. It was again followed by an oligarchic revolution, this time carried through with the help of victorious Spartan arms. A commission of 30 was set up. In theory, they were to frame a new constitution, but in practice they retained power in their own hands and used it to settle old scores, and any good they may have done initially in purging the city of wrongdoers was forgotten in the savage tyranny that followed. It was a tyranny that lasted only 8 months. The 30 were driven out and subsequently killed, and the democratic constitution is in all essentials the same, restored. Athens was tired of extremists, and on the whole the restored democracy acted with sense and moderation. But it did one thing which Plato could never forgive. In 399 BC, it put Socrates to death on a charge of impiety and corrupting the young. We have Plato's own account in his 7th letter, written when he was an old man, of his experience during these years when he was a young man of about 23 to 28. Quote, "I had much the same experience as many other young men. I expected when I came of age to go into politics. The political situation gave me an opportunity. The existing constitution, which was subject to widespread criticism, was overthrown, and a committee of 30 given supreme power. As it happened, some of them were friends and relations of mine, and they at once invited me to join them, as if it were the natural thing for me to do. My feelings were what were to be expected in a young man. I thought they were going to reform society and rule justly, and so I watched their proceedings with deep interest. I found that they soon made the earlier regime look like a golden age. Among other things, they tried to incriminate my old friend Socrates, whom I should not hesitate to call the most upright man then living, by sending him with others to arrest a fellow citizen and bring him forcibly to execution. Socrates refused, and risked everything rather than make himself party to their wickedness. When I saw all this, and other things as bad, I was disgusted and drew back from the wickedness of the times. Not long afterwards the 30 fell, and the constitution was changed, and again, though less keenly, I felt the desire to enter politics. Those were troublous times, and many things were done to which one could object, nor was it surprising that vengeance should sometimes be excessive in a revolution. Nonetheless, the returned Democrats behaved on the whole with moderation. Unfortunately, however, some of those in power brought my friend Socrates to trial on a monstrous charge, the last that could be made against him, the charge of impiety, and he was condemned and executed." End quote. And that's from Plato's 7th letter. Hello, Kelly. You're very welcome. Welcome to the stream. Plato was probably quite young when he first met Socrates. At any rate, he represents him in his dialogues as being well known to members of his family, for example, Adamanthus and Glaucon in the Republic. But whenever the meeting took place, it was a turning point in Plato's life. Socrates' position in European thought is unique. He wrote nothing, yet through his followers, of whom others besides Plato wrote dialogues in which he figured, he has influenced subsequent thought as much as any other single person. In his later years, when Plato knew him, he devoted himself entirely to discussing ethical questions. The oracle at Delphi, in response to an inquiry by one of his admirers, had said that he was the wisest man in Greece. Socrates was sure that he was not, and set out to prove the oracle wrong. His method of doing so was to cross-question people he met about their beliefs, and about their ethical beliefs in particular, since for a Greek, wisdom had a strongly ethical meaning. And his questions would commonly take the form of asking people what they meant when they referred to common ethical qualities like self-control, or justice, or courage. He found that they did not really know, or at any rate could give no satisfactory account of what they meant, and to that extent he was wiser than they. He was aware of his ignorance, they were not, and this is covered in great length in the Alcibiades. But the cure of ignorance is knowledge, and so, in addition to showing that conventional moral notions were frequently confused and contradictory, Socrates insisted on the importance in morals of knowledge. If only we knew what justice was, then, he argued, the problems of being just would be comparatively simple, and in quest of that knowledge he never ceased his constant examination of himself and others. But being cross-examined with the penetrating thoroughness of Socrates was not an experience which everyone enjoyed, and with all his uncompromising honesty and his essential piety, Socrates was hardly an orthodox character, and Athens had had enough of unorthodoxy. Socrates was linked in the minds of many Athenians with the skepticism and questioning of accepted beliefs, which they blamed for their many misfortunes. What was needed, they felt, was a greater respect for the principles of conventional morality, not a questioning of them. In addition, many of Socrates' associates were of oligarchic sympathies, and this, though he was himself a man of no party, cannot have endeared him to the restored democracy. The amnesty declared after the defeat of the 30 was honoured, but there were many who regarded him as an undesirable political influence. Whatever the immediate occasion of Socrates' trial or the details of his indictment, it was this mixture of feeling that led to his condemnation. And that is covered in the trial and death of Socrates. His indictment and the trial and the execution is covered in Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. But to Plato his condemnation meant a final disillusionment with contemporary politics. The passage from the 7th letter already quoted continues, and we're back to the quote from the 7th letter, quote, "When I considered all this, the more closely I studied the politicians and the laws and customs of the day, and the older I grew, the more difficult it seemed to me to govern rightly. Nothing could be done without trustworthy friends and supporters, and these were not easy to come by in an age which had abandoned its traditional moral code, but found it impossibly difficult to create a new one. At the same time, law and morality were deteriorating at an alarming rate, with the result that though I had been full of eagerness for a political career, the sight of all this chaos made me giddy, and though I never stopped thinking how things might be improved and the constitution reformed, I postponed action, waiting for a favourable opportunity. Finally, I came to the conclusion that all existing states were badly governed, and that their constitutions were incapable of reform without drastic treatment and a great deal of good luck. I was forced, in fact, to the belief that the only hope of finding justice for society or for the individual lay in true philosophy, and that mankind will have no respite from trouble until either real philosophers gain political power or politicians become by some miracle true philosophers." And that is an idea that he expands more fully in the Republic, and like he says, or politicians become by some miracle true philosophers. And yeah, just look at the politicians governing your own country and ask yourself how close they are to true philosophers. This, in a few words, is the theme of the Republic, from which the concluding sentence is borrowed with some verbal alteration. Plato's decision to abandon a political career was finally taken during the 10 years or so after Socrates' death. During those years he is said to have travelled to Cyrene, to Egypt, and perhaps to Phoenicia, but much of his time must have been spent in Athens, as we are told that he served in the Athenian army in 3 campaigns. He also wrote his first dialogues, beginning with a defence of Socrates, constituting with others in which he explored the implications of Socrates' life and thought, and ending probably with the Gorgias. in which the life of philosophy and the life of politics are confronted and politics rejected, and the particular bitterness and emotional tension of this last dialogue show how difficult the decision had been. In 388 to 387 BC, Plato visited South Italy, perhaps in order to make the acquaintance of some of the Pythagorean philosophers living there. The Orphic Pythagorean belief in the afterlife and the Pythagorean emphasis on mathematics as philosophical discipline certainly influenced him strongly, as can be seen in the Republic. From Italy he crossed to Sicily and visited the court of Dionysius I of Syracuse, where he learned something of tyranny at first hand. He also made the acquaintance of the tyrant's brother-in-law, Dion, who was deeply impressed with Plato's ideas about politics and was later to try with him to turn the younger Dionysius into a philosopher-ruler. But this visit to Syracuse did not last long. Plato is said to have offended Dionysius, who, according to one version of the story, sold him into slavery, from which he was redeemed by a friend. He returned to Athens and there, in about the year 386 BC, founded the Academy, where he taught for the rest of his life. The Academy was founded as a school for statesmen. Plato had decided that nothing could be done with contemporary politics and contemporary politicians. He therefore decided to set up a school where a new type of politician could be trained, and where the would-be politician might learn to be a philosopher-ruler. He probably did not expect any very immediate results, but he continued to hope, in his own phrase, that he might turn some statesmen into philosophers, and the Academy was always under Plato, quote, primarily a school of philosophic statesmen. It was not without a rival. A few years before, Socrates had also founded a school at Athens. He was continuing the tradition started by the sophists in the previous century. They were travelling teachers and lecturers who appeared in the middle of the century in response to the demand for an education that went beyond the grounding in the works of the poets which formed the traditional Greek curriculum. They taught most things, but since success in life is what most men want, and since the ability to persuade your neighbour is always an important element in success, and was particularly important in the Greek democracies, they all taught rhetoric, the art of self-expression and persuasion. From this purely practical political interest, many of them proceeded to political and moral theory. Thrasymachus, in Book 1 of the Republic, is typical of this side of their activity, and he was typical too in charging fees for his instruction. Socrates himself criticized the sophists of his day for triviality and pretentiousness. Nonetheless, the rhetorical training which he offered was a continuation of the educational tradition which they started. He believed that a training in the art of self-expression, in the art of composing and setting out a coherent and persuasive argument, provided in itself an educational discipline that was, together with the literary studies on which it was based, the best preparation for life. If it did not teach morality directly, yet by inculcating standards of good taste and by the intellectual discipline which it involved, it should give what was in effect a moral training. Socrates therefore claimed that his methods turned out better men and better statesmen than Plato's, and in fact a training in rhetoric remained the standard form of higher education in the ancient world. Plato's conception of higher education was quite different. Briefly, he thought rhetoric superficial because it gave you the means of expression without guarding you against its abuse. The statesman must first know how society is to be run. Exposition and persuasion come afterwards. For detail, we must turn to the Republic, the product of Plato's early years in the Academy. We cannot be certain of its exact date, but if we think of it as having been written about 375 BC, we shall not be far wrong. And the section on the education of the philosopher, part 8 in this edition, and who knows what it is in the Hackett Publishing edition, I imagine part 8 as well, gives in substance the kind of study that Plato thought suitable for the philosopher-ruler, and the kind of study, mathematics with an increasing stress on mathematical astronomy, and dialectic, comprising what we should today call logic and philosophical discussion, that was in fact pursued in the Academy. The Republic, in short, is a statement of the aims which the Academy set itself to achieve. So that's a very interesting point there from the translator. The Republic, in short, is a statement of the aims which the Academy itself set to achieve. So by studying the Republic, we are gaining the ideas and the views which Plato, the aims which the Academy set itself to achieve. So if we can embody the Republic in our own life, we're sort of bringing Plato's Academy into the modern day, in a sense, according to that sentence. The rest of Plato's life is only relevant to the reader of the Republic insofar as it illustrates further the attitude to politics already described. He never lost the hope of being able to turn a statesman into a philosopher. When Dionysius I died in 367 BC, Plato's friend Dion, now chief minister in Syracuse, invited him to come and train Dionysius II, who was then 28, as a philosopher-statesman. Plato went without hesitation and can have had few illusions about the difficulty of his task. His visit was not a success. Dionysius did not trust Dion, was old to enter on any course of training, and detested the mathematics Plato expected him to do. Dion was banished, and shortly afterwards Plato left. He had been there about a year. He returned in 361 on the invitation of Dionysius, who, in spite of his dislike of mathematics, seemed to have liked Plato, or perhaps wanted to impress him. Plato hoped to reconcile Dion and Dionysius, but he failed, and returned again to Athens after about a year. Dion resorted to force, and after various vicissitudes, during which he first tried to set up a constitution in which autocracy was tempered by legal checks and some degree of popular control, and then proceeded to repression and violence, he was finally assassinated in 354 BC. Plato did nothing to encourage him in these last years, though he continued to regard him with affection, felt his loss deeply, and regarded it as a disaster for Sicily. Dion was undoubtedly sincere, a man of courage and enterprise, but he was something of a prig, and, like many political idealists, inclined to resort to force when the world refused to accept his ideals. Rather happier is the story of Plato's dealing with Hermias of Atarneus, of which we learn something in the 6th letter. Atarneus is in northwest Asia Minor, and Hermias had made himself a kingdom in that area. He had probably visited Athens and been impressed by the teaching in the Academy, and when 2 members of the Academy, Erastus and Coriscus, returned to their native city of Sepsis, in his kingdom, he got in touch with them and seemed to have associated them in some way with him as advisers in his government. This is the situation assumed by the 6th letter, of which Hermias, Erastus, and Coriscus are joint addressees, and it illustrates well what in Plato's view was the educational purpose of the Academy. It was to be a training ground for rulers, not only maintaining a particular political theory, but also furnishing practical guidance to such of its members who had attained to political power. Hermias, or Hermias, I'm going to go with Hermias, is said to have turned his tyranny into a milder form of government on the advice of the philosophers, and to have handed over Assos to them to rule in gratitude for what they had done. It was at Assos that Aristotle joined them after Plato's death, and when he in turn left to become a tutor of Alexander the Great, he was carrying on the Platonic tradition. All this took place during the last 10 years of Plato's life, and shows his continued hope of finding the philosopher-statesman. And if he looked for him at Syracuse and Atarneus in the courts of a tyrant, That was because he believed that political control must always be in the hands of a minority, and where it was concentrated in the hands of one man, his conversion was all that was necessary to bring philosophy to bear on the conduct of affairs. With the continued hope of practical intervention went the continued interest in theory, and Plato's last and longest work, The Laws, is again about politics. And the laws, if we enjoy and benefit and get value from the Republic, we can do the laws later in the same format. It is the work of his old age, said to have been left unrevised at his death in 347 BC, and though it makes more concessions to common sense and practical possibilities than the Republic, it remains very much akin to it in its general approach. Those who have read the Republic have read all the essential things Plato has to say on basic principles. How he thought those principles could be translated into action is less clear. Plato himself warns us in several places in the Republic of the difference between theory and practice, and it contains comparatively little about the detail of practical, legal, or constitutional arrangements. In his later works, the Politicus and Laws, he stressed the importance of law, and the governmental and administrative arrangements in the laws are less austerely autocratic than those in the Republic. As Mr. Saunders had said, to suppose that Plato ever thought that the Republic was attainable would be to suppose him capable not merely of optimism or idealism, but of sheer political naivety. So I don't know who Mr. Saunders is. Just his translation, which may be the translation I have. While Mr. Crombie has similarly remarked that the Republic is not intended to make a direct contribution to practical politics. It is better, therefore, to treat it as a statement of principles whose application would vary with time and place and circumstance. Thus, it may in principle be true that the position assigned to women in Greek society, and indeed in other societies, entailed a gross waste of the talents of one half of the human race, and that, if full use is to be made of them, some means must be found to free women to a greater or lesser extent from the ties of family life. But what Plato thought to be possible in practice is to be found in the laws, rather than in the extreme statement in the Republic. It seems likely, therefore, that the laws represents more nearly what, in practice, Plato at any time thought might be possible. There is a distinct similarity between what Dion at one point hoped to achieve and some of the provisions in the laws. Plato believed indeed that politics was a sphere in which reason should operate. His fault was less that he failed to see that theory and practice must differ, though he did fail sometimes, than that he never allowed enough for the element of sheer unreason in politics and human affairs. And so that's chapter 1 of the introduction, if you like, and chapter 2 is on Plato on contemporary society. A good way to approach the Republic itself is to consider the actual types of Greek constitution of which Plato took account when he wrote it. These he deals with in Book 8, Part 9 in this edition, where he lists them as timachy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. The type of society which Plato calls timachy is one which has no real parallel in modern experience, because it is, as he explicitly tells us, a sketch of the essential features of Spartan society. But for Plato, Sparta was very important indeed, and some of the features of his own ideal society are borrowed from it. The Spartans were, briefly, a military aristocracy living among a subject population, the Helots. These Helots were peasant serfs, cultivating the land for their Spartan masters. They could be called on to serve as light-armed troops in war, and might occasionally win their freedom, but in general they had neither rights nor privileges. Each year the magistrates declared war on them, so that to kill a Helot was an act of war, and not of murder, and the Spartan secret police watched constantly for disaffection, and killed mercilessly when they found it. And that's another interesting point, isn't it? So that to kill a helot was an act of war and not of murder. And that distinction there, just that very simple distinction, when you kill a man in war, it's just war. But if you kill a man in civil society, then it's murder. Very interesting point there, just in the introduction. It was largely because they were a minority, living thus in a subject population which they always feared would revolt, and which on several occasions did, that the Spartans followed their peculiar way of life. They were a military caste in which the individual was rigidly subordinated to the community. Each citizen was a soldier, and education, marriage, and the details of daily life were all strictly regulated with a view to the maintenance of perfect military efficiency. When a child was born, it was submitted to the inspection of the heads of the tribe, and if they judged it to be unhealthy or weak, it was exposed to die on the slopes of Mount Tegetos. At the age of 7 years, the boy was consigned to the care of a state officer, and the course of his education was entirely determined by the purpose of inuring him to bear hardships, training him to endure an exacting discipline, and instilling into his heart a sentiment of devotion to the state. The boys up to the age of 20 were marshalled in a huge school, formed in the model of an army. And if you've ever seen 300, you'll know all about the Spartans. Here they were under the instruction of young men aged 20 to 30 who were not yet of age to be admitted to full citizenship. At 20 they entered on military service and were permitted to marry, but they must still live in barracks and could only pay fugitive and stolen visits to their wives. At 30 they became full citizens, but though they might live at home, they must still dine together in common messes, to which each made a fixed contribution from the lot which each Spartan owned, which he might not alienate, and which was cultivated for him by his helot serfs. Spartan discipline extended itself to women too. The girls, in common with the boys, went through a gymnastic training, and it was not considered immodest for them to practice their exercises almost nude. They enjoyed a freedom which was in marked contrast with the seclusion of the women in other Greek states. They had a high repute for chastity, but if the government directed them to breed children for the state, they had no scruples in obeying the command, though it should involve a violation of the sanctity of the marriage tie. No Spartan was allowed to possess wealth in the form of gold or silver, and they continued to use a clumsy iron coinage. Private luxury was forbidden, and Spartan simplicity was proverbial. The individual was entirely lost in the state. He had no life, no problems of his own. He lived in a camp under military discipline, ready at any moment to fight for his country. It was not surprising that the Spartans were the most efficient soldiers in Greece, though they were not an aggressive people, but notoriously difficult to provoke to war. These are the features of the Spartan system most relevant to a reader of the Republic. Its constitutional arrangements, a unique combination of hereditary kingship, popular election and magistrates and council of elders, are comparatively unimportant, save perhaps in the respect paid to age and experience. Membership of the council was restricted to those over 60, and in the Republic the status of full guardianship cannot be reached till 50. The Spartan system had many admirers in Greece. It had a completeness and aesthetic simplicity which appealed to the Greek mind and made many Greeks admire it, though few would have wished to live under it. But if they admired, they also criticized, and the criticisms Plato makes of Timochy are typical. He criticizes its exploitation of the lowest class as a wrong relation between ruler and ruled, liable to lead to serious disunity. He criticizes its intellectual limitations. Spartans thought little and were proverbially slow-witted. They were also, in spite of their system, notoriously avaricious, and so Timothy is criticized for the institution of private property, forbidden in the ideal state, and the consequent growth of private greed. The Spartan and the Timarchic society, in short, have the merits of discipline, respect for law, and courage, but are stupid, greedy, and brutal to their less privileged classes. Plato may to some extent have shared the admiration often felt by other Greeks for Sparta, but he was well aware of Spartan limitations. The Spartan system was without parallel, except in Crete. But the other three types of social system which Plato mentions were common. Indeed, one may generalize and say that in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Greek cities were either democracies or oligarchies, interspersed here and there with tyrannies. During the Peloponnesian War, the oligarchies had, on the whole, sided with Sparta, the democracies with Athens, and party differences, always acute in Greece, had been exacerbated by the suspicion that the other party was in league with the enemy. The suspicion was often justified, for both democrat and oligarch habitually put party first, and Plato's references to a party getting help against its opponents from outside, and his deep horror of faction and disunity, are a reflection of the bitterness of party strife, of which Thucydides had left the classic description. Again, quote from Thucydides: "Both sides claimed to have the good of the community at heart, while both in fact aimed at political control, and in their struggle for ascendancy indulged in the worst excesses." To Plato, an oligarchy was a society in which power and prestige went with wealth, and since the wealthy are normally few, where power goes with wealth, political control is in the hands of a minority. The days of hereditary aristocracy were long over, and though there were of course old families in most states, like Plato's own at Athens, birth had had to come to terms with wealth and by itself was at the most of limited political influence. So, though Plato's characterization of oligarchy may be an oversimplification, it is not an unfair generalization to say that oligarchy in his day meant control by a wealthy minority. It was the controlling influence given to wealth that Plato particularly disliked. He had the deepest distrust of what would today be called the profit motive and of the political influence of private wealth, and he thought that in an oligarchy, an accusative society, you were bound to get increasing exploitation of poor by rich, and an increasing degree of social maladjustment and disunity in consequence. He draws a picture of growing oppression met by growing bitterness and ending in revolution. In his account of democracy, Plato is drawing on his own experiences at Athens, and it is important to remember what a democracy in 5th and 4th century Greece was like. The Greeks lived in city-states, small communities consisting of a city nucleus with an area of agricultural land attached, from which the urban population drew all or most of its food supply. The populations varied in size, but were all small by the standards of a modern city. The population of Athens when Plato was born was perhaps 200 to 300,000, including men, women, and slaves, and Athens was by Greek standards large. That's interesting to think, isn't it? 200 to 300,000 people were living in Athens at like 400 BC. At Athens, slaves may have numbered some 60 to 80,000, and there were perhaps 35 to 40,000 metics, that is, residents who, because they had been born elsewhere, did not qualify for citizenship. The total voting population was about 35 to 45,000. But within this body of voting citizens, popular control was complete. For the Greeks never invented representative government, and the sovereign body at Athens was the assembly, a mass meeting of all adult male citizens. Of course, not all citizens bothered to attend regularly, and some whose homes were outside Athens itself found it difficult to do so. But in theory all could attend, and both in theory and in practice the assembly was the sovereign body by which all political decisions must be made. It was not practicable for it to meet too often. In theory, it met 10 times a year. In practice, a good deal more often, though probably never more than once a week. And to carry on the business of state between meetings, to deal with much routine and financial business, and above all to draft business for meetings of the assembly, there was a council of 500. This further subdivided into committees of 50, each of which was responsible for carrying on public business during 1/10 of the year. But important as the council's functions were, its powers were in practice limited by the rule that it should be chosen by lot from the citizen body, that membership was limited to 1 year, and that no citizen might hold membership more than twice. The council thus never became a continuing body with a policy of its own. The assembly remained supreme. Finally, the law courts also were in popular control. Nearly all cases were tried before panels of jurors drawn by a system of mixed lot and election from the citizen body, and before these panels the magistrates could be tried for any irregularities committed during their year of office. Such a complete system of popular control has never been known before or since, and it is important to remember that this, and not any form of modern representative government, is the background to Plato's comments on democracy. Its workings in 5th century Athens and the criticisms then made of it have already been mentioned. It involved, said Thucydides, committing the conduct of state affairs to the whims of the multitude, end quote. And it has been described by a modern writer as government by perpetual plebiscite. But, wide as the differences of background are, it would be quite wrong to dismiss Plato's criticisms of democracy as having no relevance today. If we are tempted to do so, we may perhaps remind ourselves that this is the first generation since his when a political leader can address and be seen by the whole electorate. What the ultimate effects of television will be we cannot yet say. But they have certainly brought political leaders far closer to the ordinary citizen and opened up opportunities of a direct approach to the whole electorate that did not exist in modern society. What then are Plato's criticisms in the Republic? If we look first at the similes of the ship's captain and the large and powerful animal, they seem to be twofold. First, that the people are bad judges in many political matters. The common man has no experience or knowledge of such things as foreign policies or economics, and to expect any very sensible judgment from him on such matters is to expect the impossible. He will judge on impulse, sentiment, or prejudice, and though his heart may be sound, and Plato would have doubted whether even this was always true, his head will be muddled. This drawback might perhaps be overcome by good leadership. But here we come to the second criticism, that democracy encourages bad leadership. The people's judgment of their leaders is not always good, and they can't be trusted to make the best choice. But quite apart from that, the popular leader, dependent as he is for his position, and perhaps his income, on popular favour, will constantly be tempted to retain that favour by the easiest possible means. He will play on the likes and dislikes, the weaknesses and foibles of the public, will never tell them an unpleasant truth or advocate a policy that might make them uncomfortable. Like the modern advertiser and salesman, he is dependent on his public, and his position depends on selling them comfort and not telling them the truth. Sophists, salesmen, and popular politicians are on a par, and the people care little who their leaders are, provided they profess themselves the people's friends. Popular leaders are as devoid of true knowledge as are the people they lead. But that is not the whole story. The salient characteristic of democracy we learn in Book 8 is liberty. Every individual is free to do as he likes. This gives democratic society a diversity and variety that are very attractive, but its effect is extremely disintegrating. There is a growing dislike of any authority, political or moral. Fathers pander to their sons, teachers to their pupils, and the minds of the citizens become so sensitive that the least vestige of restraint is resented as intolerable. Where there is so little social cohesion, dissension inevitably grows. Politically, it takes the form of a struggle between rich and poor, which finally degenerates into class war. The poor have no use for the rich except to squeeze taxes out of them. The rich retaliate, and the freedom which the Democrat claims will be a freedom of the two nations, the rich and the poor, to fight it out between themselves who shall have the larger slice of the cake. Morally, it leads to greater and greater permissiveness, and Plato's description of a permissive society in Book 8 has a particularly sharp-edged vividness. And what also has a sharp-edged vividness is H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, where the rich and the poor, the two classes, rich and the poor, have actually evolved into different species, the Eloi and the Morlocks. And it's fascinating how H.G. Wells portrays this evolution of rich and poor, haves and have-nots, if you like, and how they coexist in sort of, as different species. The human race, Homo sapiens, has evolved into two different species. So it's very interesting there. And you could argue that in current society it's happening, isn't it? All this stuff with COVID and all these other things is political. I'm not a politically minded person, but some of the commentators say shrinking the working class and broadening this wealth gap. But we're not here to talk about that, are we? We're here to read the introduction. There remains tyranny. Plato describes it as arising out of the chaos and dissension into which democracy degenerates, and though he would probably not have wished to maintain that this was an invariable rule, yet some tyrants, ancient and modern, have certainly started as popular leaders, and extreme social disunity may by reaction produce an extreme authoritarianism. Of Plato's treatment of tyranny, three things may be said. 1. For him, tyranny is essentially a personal rule. The tyrant needs followers, of course, and at a fairly early stage in his career he secures a personal bodyguard, a private army bound to him by ties of common interest and guilt. But the basis of his power is a personal one. He is the leader, and his rule is essentially the exercise of his own personal preferences, the arbitrary rule of an individual. 2. Tyranny has a peculiar self-destructiveness. The tyrant can brook no rival, which means that prominent personalities among his followers must be eliminated. Anyone who can or will stand up to him will be swept away, and he needs constant wars, external crisis, and to distract attention from his internal misrule, which is another source of strain. And 3. The tyrant is essentially what we should call a criminal type. The beginning of Book 9 is an analysis of the similarity of the tyrant and the criminal, who are said to combine the characteristics of drunkard, sex-maniac and madman. The tyrant with his master passion is barely sane, and his life is one of criminal indulgence. Fielding had the same thought in Jonathan Wild. Hello there. Oh, Ariana. Haven't fallen asleep yet. Still listening. It's very interesting. Very interesting. I'm glad you're not asleep yet. There is little need to comment on this analysis. The dominance of a dictator's personality, his private army, the purges among his followers are familiar. We might comment that his private life need not always be as wildly dissolute as Plato suggests. He is more formidable, though not necessarily less criminal or violent if it is not. But we still associate autocracy with repression and violence. The purpose of this section has been to show, by reviewing Plato's analysis of contemporary forms of society, what he thought the major social evils of his time were. For it was to combat those evils that his own proposals were put forward. We may summarize as follows. In Timochy, Sparta, Plato saw two major evils: the evil of a split community, in which one section exploits and holds down the remainder by force, and the evil and the evil of lack of intelligence. The Spartan might have many good qualities, but he simply had not the intellectual capacity to know what he was doing. Indeed, he mistrusted the intellect and everything to do with it. In oligarchy, the cardinal fault is desire for wealth, a fault which was already apparent in Timothy. Wealth as a social motive is to be mistrusted, and a ruling class which is devoted to its wealth and which owes its position and power to wealth will substitute exploitation for government. In democracy there is a radical lack of cohesion because there is no proper respect for authority, moral or political. Democratic government is weak government, which plays on the weaknesses of the common man instead of giving him the leadership he needs, and it is liable to degenerate into a bitter class struggle between haves and have-nots. Finally, in tyranny we see the danger that the violent and criminal instincts normally kept under control will get out of hand. The criminal is present in all societies, certainly in oligarchy and democracy, but in tyranny he has come into his own, and society is run by its criminal elements with the arch-criminal in charge. We may briefly sum up by saying that disunity, incompetence and violence, which he had seen at Athens and at Syracuse, were the main dangers against which Plato thought society must be protected. And part 3 is the main ideas of the Republic. And so we still have a fair few pages to go, guys. A very thorough introduction in this Penguin Classic Edition, so I like it. Part 3 of the introduction, the main ideas of the Republic. The title Republic is doubly misleading to a modern reader. In the first place, it suggests that Plato might be writing about a republic in the modern sense, that is, about a particular form of government. In fact, the title in Greek can mean indifferently constitution, state, or society. The Latin translation is republica, a word bearing originally the same sort of meanings, and only coming later to bear the narrower meaning of a particular kind of constitution, the meaning it now bears in the English transliteration. Plato, in fact, was writing about society or the state, and that is what his title means. The mistranslation is now hallowed by time, and it would be pedantic to change it, but explanation is required. But when that explanation has been given, the modern reader may still find something rather different from what it leads him to expect. He will expect, in a work on politics, some references to ethics or education. They are topics which recur constantly both in political practice and theory. But he will also expect a great deal of discussion of constitutional and legal matters. What is to be the sovereign body? How is its sovereignty to be exercised? What are to be the relations of legislature, executive and judiciary? How is executive power to be exercised? What subordinate bodies or organizations are there to be, and what powers are they to have? These are the sort of questions which he will expect to find examined. In fact, when he turns to the Republic, he will hardly find them mentioned at all. There is, of course, a good deal of discussion of social and political matters. For example, the discussion of contemporary forms of society, which section 2 of this introduction has been concerned, and which occupies most of books 8 and 9. And parts 2, 4 and 6 deal largely with political and social topics. But even in these parts of the book, Plato is more interested in principles than in details, and we find moral considerations constantly coming in. And the rest of the work is largely devoted to what we should regard as ethics, part 1 and 5, education, parts 3 and 8, theory of knowledge, part 7, art, part 10, and religion, part 11. For this there are several reasons. The Greek city-state, as we have seen, was a comparatively simple affair. There was less constitutional machinery to talk about. And just because the political community was smaller and more intimate, the Greeks distinguished less sharply than we do between ethics and politics. We tend to think that there is a sphere of private conduct where the state is not concerned, where, as we should say, it is a matter for the individual conscience. But, on the whole, that way of thinking is foreign to the Greeks. The ancient Greek view was that the law of the state is the source of all standards of human life, and that the virtue of the individual is the same as the virtue of the citizen. This is perhaps an overstatement, but it serves to bring out the difference of the Greek approach, an approach which did not prevent the Greeks from being violently individualistic in practice, but which did make them link politics and ethics more closely than we do. But there are further, more particular reasons. The Republic, as we have seen, was written in the years after the founding of the Academy. The Academy's aim was to train philosopher-statesmen, and the Republic, as a statement of that aim, was bound to deal at length with education. Plato had decided that the world's ills would not be cured till philosophers ruled. The education of philosophers therefore becomes the most important of political activities. If they can be educated rightly and given power, the details of administration can safely be left in their hands. This Plato explicitly says. For all these reasons, the Republic was bound to deal at length with education and with the moral principles underlying the organization of society, as well as with the general lines on which it should ideally be organized, which leaves little room for more practical details, much as we should often like to have them. We have therefore a book which is as much about ethics and education and philosophy as about politics in the strict sense. To some of Plato's ideas in these fields we now turn. So again, we're in part 3, the main ideas of the Republic, and the first is ethics. The Republic starts with a moral and political question. What is justice? The Greek word dikaiosune is a wide one and covers both individual and social morality, and from the start, therefore, the inquiry is concerned with both individual and community, both ethics and politics. It soon becomes clear that the question that is being asked is, what is the basis of social and moral obligation? Why should I be either law-abiding or moral if I don't feel like it? More simply still, why should I be good? The problem is stated in 3 stages. First, Socrates shows that the conventional view that justice is giving a man his due is inadequate. Then Thrasymachus comes in with what is, in effect, a flat denial of the conventional view. He is, as we have seen, a typical sophist, and is meant to stand as the representative of a line of thought, not uncommon at the end of the 5th century, which rejected conventional morality as a sham and substituted self-interest. This section of the argument is often rather complicated. See the section headings. Its purpose is to advance the argument a stage by showing that though conventional morality may often be muddled and inadequate, that it is equally unsatisfactory to reject it as a sham. After Thrasymachus has been reduced to silence, Glaucon and Adamanthus, who remain the chief respondents throughout the rest of the dialogue, say that they are still unsatisfied and that they are going to restate his case for him. And what they in effect ask Socrates to do is to show them that morality is more than a matter of social approval. Glaucon puts the case that morality is a matter of self-expediency, an agreement made for mutual convenience, that we are only moral because it pays us or it is a part of a bargain, but that given the chance we should all behave extremely bad. Adamanthus reinforces him by stressing the comparatively mercenary motives normally advanced for good behaviour. The problem they put to Socrates is to show that, quite apart from motives of reward or social approval, morality is preferable in itself to immorality, right to wrong. Socrates' immediate reply is to say that the problem is too difficult to solve in the individual. He must look at it in larger letters, in society. And so there follows in parts 2, 3 and 4 the first sketch of the ideal society. But when he returns to the individual in part 5, he tries to answer the question in the way that he has been asked. He tries, that is, to show by an analysis of the elements in the human mind that its well-being, full development and happiness are to be secured by doing right, and not only by doing wrong, to prove thereby that virtue is its own reward. And though other rewards, including rewards and punishments in the life after death, are brought in Book 10, they are merely a secondary consideration. And that's an interesting paragraph there, because it gives a good general outline of what happens in the Republic. They're discussing these ideas of virtue and morality in an individual, and Plato then says, isn't it easier to see the writing in larger letters? And he says, so why don't we zoom out and look at something much bigger, the city state? And then he like it says here in book parts 2, 3 and 4, sketches the idea of an ideal society, and then in part 5 zooms back in to look at the individual. The elements in the mind which the moralist has to take into account are, according to Plato, threefold, and it has been suggested that this threefold division is a more or less arbitrary reflection into the individual of the three classes into which his state is organized. The matter is hardly as simple as that. The three elements in the mind and the three classes in society may have a common source in the Orphic Pythagorean tradition, but one is unlikely to have produced the other directly. But the criticism, though an oversimplification, does bring out a feature of Plato's thought, his tendency to argue from the state or community to the individual rather than vice versa. He is inclined to decide first what he thinks would socially be desirable, and then to cut the individual to fit it, rather than to think of the individual first, and then consider how his needs can be met. Though, therefore, it is unlikely that the three elements in the mind were invented to fit the three classes in the state, the movement of thought from society to individual is significant. Hello there, everyone. Hope you're enjoying this full and in-depth introduction. That the threefold division is not, however, without foundation in experience is suggested in the heading to Part 5, but it must be regarded as an attempt to classify the elements involved in moral conflict and decision, and not as a full account of human psychology. There are large parts of human experience, such as sensation and perception, which it does not attempt to touch, and it is better treated as a classification of motives for action, as which it has some merits, than as an exhaustive or scientific analysis of the mind, which it certainly is not. The main criticism that can be made of it from this point of view is that it omits any consideration of what we call the will. But we are often extremely hazy about what we mean by the will. It is, to the ordinary man, little more than a label for the fact that we often have to make an effort to make ourselves do things, and Plato would probably claim to have sufficiently recognized that fact in his element of reason, which clearly includes not only the faculty of deliberation, but also the ability to decide and to act on our decisions, however much effort that calls for. We all know the difference between acting from deliberate choice, acting from a generous impulse, and acting on animal appetite, and that is the difference which Plato is trying to express. His answer to the question, what is justice, is that in the individual it consists in keeping a proper balance between the three elements. Each will then be doing its own job. True morality consists, in fact, in giving due satisfaction to the different elements in us, and preventing any of them dominating at the expense of the others. Physical desire, ambition, and intellect must all have their due and proper fulfillment, and find their proper place in the good life. That, in short, is Plato's solution of the problem of individual morality, and there are two questions, at any rate, which it may prompt us to ask. Three questions. Two questions. 1. Is the threefold classification of impulses really adequate? It has been suggested that it is not without foundation, and that the criticism that it ignores the will can to some extent be met. But how adequate and how useful is it all the same? How far does it do justice to the complexities of moral choice? And 2. The formula as it stands, though it tells us a great deal, leaves a good many blanks. What is the proper place of intellect and appetite? What is the satisfaction due to each? How is the balance to be struck? Plato's own answer the reader must glean from the text, but one is left with the impression that it would be a good deal more ascetic than the ordinary man would find comfortable. The guardian's life is austere, to say the least of it, and little as we know of the life of the third class, what we do know does not suggest that it will be luxurious. Clearly we can fill in the formula in different ways, but Plato, though he has no wish to eradicate physical appetite, took on the whole a low view of physical pleasures, and his own interpretation would have been an austere one. He never seems to have looked very kindly on the ordinary man's pleasures. Of the nature of justice in society as opposed to the individual, little needs be said. Justice is defined as minding your own business. That's a bit simple, isn't it? A simplification there. Justice is defined as minding your own business. That is, fulfilling your proper function in society. When all are doing that, there is no room for the most dreaded of evils, disunity, and there are few who would quarrel in general terms with the view that social justice has been achieved when each class and element in society is fulfilling its proper function. But again, the formula leaves many blanks. What are the different classes or elements in society? What is their proper function and what is their due? Does not Plato lay himself open to Sir Karl Popper's charge that under this formula the criterion of morality is the interest of the state? Morality is nothing but political hygiene. But these are questions that are largely political, and the discussion of Plato's answers to them must for the moment be postponed. And just a quick comment there about it tickled me somewhat. Justice is defined as minding your own business, and in all of this this current woke stuff and social justice, it's the complete opposite. It's getting in everyone else's business, telling them what they have to do, how they have to behave. So it's completely unjust, according to whoever's this translator, Desmond Lee. You know, if you're minding your own business, it doesn't matter what anyone else does, if they're a transgender or if they're gay or whatever, you know, whatever religion or things they practice. If you're minding your own business, it doesn't matter. But if you're in everyone else's business, then yeah, well, we'll get into it in the full text when we come to it next week. And the second part of what Plato covers in the book, in the dialogue, is education. Plato's views of education can largely be left to speak for themselves. He thought it of paramount importance, and, since commentaries on him have nearly all been written by dons or schoolmasters, he has been much praised for so thinking. Without in any way questioning the importance of education, one may perhaps ask whether it really has quite the power to transform society that Plato and others had thought. There are so many other influences that determine both society and the individual, and anyone engaged in the business of teaching who keeps his sense of proportion will perhaps view his work with a little greater skepticism and a little more saving humility. But there are one or two other points, besides the conviction of its importance, which are noteworthy in what Plato has to say on the subject. He was the first person to formulate what we should today call a university course, for that is what his course of further education is, even though it is spread out over a far longer period, and the academy, though it may have had a rival in the school of Socrates and predecessors in the sophists, was the first university in Europe. The literary education which precedes it is the equivalent of our secondary and earlier stage of learning to read and write, which that implies the equivalent of our primary education, so that we may say that our three stages are all explicitly or implicitly already recognized in the Republic. As far as its curriculum is concerned, we may say that after the primary stage, in which reading and writing are the important elements, the main subjects studied in school are literary and humanistic, The Greek boy who studied Homer and other poets, and the citizen of the Republic who studied Plato's specially prepared books, was studying the literature and history of his country, and the equivalent of our Bible. And in the course of that study he would expect to learn something of the culture, history, and traditions of his own and of neighboring peoples, as well as the accepted moral and religious beliefs. At the university stage, Plato's guardians transferred their attention to mathematics, science, and philosophy, for that is what is meant in modern terms by the study of mathematics and dialectic, which Plato outlines. The natural sciences were little developed in his day, and though what he says about astronomy reads oddly today, it was the insistence in the academy on the application of mathematical methods to astronomy which created it as a science, and the exact sciences would almost certainly feature in Plato's curriculum if we were drawing it up today, while dialectic simply means philosophy. So much for intellectual content, but Plato was as concerned to train the character as the mind, and throughout the account of the secondary stage of education he is insistent that its object is moral training as much as intellectual. The section on physical education ends with an emphatic assertion that physical and intellectual education are not concerned to deal one with the mind and one with the body, but are jointly directed to the training of character. And insofar as the training of character has been a distinctive feature in English education, Plato would approve and perhaps claim to have had some influence on it. But in all he does, the educator should remember that his aim is not to put into the mind knowledge that was not there before, though he may do that within limits, but to turn the mind's eye to the light so that it can see for itself. His business, in other words, is not to stick thoughts into his pupils' heads, but to make them think for themselves. This is perhaps the best known passage on education in the Republic, because of the importance and truth of the principle which it states. We turn to the actual provision of education. It must be provided exclusively by the state. Anything of such crucial importance cannot be left to private initiative. And because of its crucial importance in forming the minds of the young, the curriculum must also be controlled and defined by the state. Plato thought, for reasons which he explains at length in Part 3, that most current Greek literature was highly unsuitable as a medium of education. He therefore proposed a rigid control which should apply not only to the school textbooks, but to art and literature. There is to be no expression of opinion other than what the state allows. The arts must be the servant of what social order requires. That is what the long sections on literature and art amount to. That the arts have their place in education and so far, by implication, a social function, we should agree. But our own habit of thought regard freedom of expression as an essential liberty, and freedom to teach what one chooses as no less essential. We should agree with Plato that it is for the state to provide education, but provision need not imply detailed control, and few would wish it to censor textbooks and determine the content of the curriculum. The classic argument for liberty of thought and expression was stated by J.S. Mill. It is enough to point the contrast. But we may note two things. First, that the degree of central control of the curriculum today varies in different parts of the world, and that whatever we think that degree of control should be, we are left with many questions to answer. What should the content of teaching be, and what its objectives for society and for the individual? Plato can at least claim to have started the debate. Second, that Plato himself, with his strong poetic sense, was obviously uneasy about his treatment of the poets, and adds in Book 10 a kind of justificatory appendix. There is no space here to discuss the aesthetic theory he puts forward. In the Laws, Book 2 and Book 7, the arts are still subordinated to social purposes, but elsewhere, notably in the Ion, Symposion, and Phaedrus, the approach is different. There, Plato speaks of artistic and other creation as something that cannot be reduced to rule. It is a form of madness, but a madness that is God-given. That madness must have experienced, that madness he must have experienced in himself, and known that it cannot be simply subjected to social purposes. The very power of the arts makes them dangerous. The tension is resolved in the Republic and laws in favour of social order. But Plato knew very well that beside Apollo, the god of order, there stood Dionysus, and that even Apollo's priestess at Delphi spoke under the influence of divine madness. Okay, so I think these will be the last few parts I'll read, although society and politics is quite a long one. Excuse me. So I've got a few pages to go. Part 3 of what the book contains, or what is it? The main ideas of the Republic, sorry. Number 3, philosophy and religion. Because the ideal state is to be governed by philosophers, philosophy inevitably plays a large part in the Republic. It is the central theme of parts 7 and 8, but the treatment of it is always rather elusive. Plato is concerned rather with the place of philosophy in the educational curriculum, the kind of studies which lead to it, its usefulness and its effects on the character, than with a detailed exposition of his philosophic beliefs. Their relevant features are brought out in a series of similes, the sun, the divided line, and the cave, but the Republic does not attempt to expound the Platonic philosophy in detail. And if you read all of the Platonic dialogues, Plato never gives you the answers. He sort of points to where you can find the answers through dialectic and philosophy, and he sort of gives you the means to find the answers. He never just says, that's what it is. The most important feature of that philosophy for the purpose of the Republic is the belief in two realms or levels of reality: the realm of change and appearance, the everyday physical world in which we live, and the realm of the forms, a realm of eternals and absolutes. For further explanation, the reader must be referred to the sections in question, especially part 7 and part 8, I think, where he talks about the allegory of the cave and the dividing line, and the introductory headings to them, but the following more general comments may be made. Though the training described in part 8 is one of rigorous intellectual discipline and training, as we might say, in the technique of exact thinking, the object at which it is aimed is a matter of personal experience. The teacher, as we have seen, turns the pupil's eye to the light. The pupil is not a passive recipient of knowledge, but must grasp the truth for himself. This applies particularly to the truths of philosophy, about which Plato writes in the 7th letter. Quote, "The truths of philosophy are not expressible, as are those of other subjects. After long study and discussion under the guidance of an experienced teacher, a spark may suddenly leap, as it were, from mind to mind, and the light of understanding, so kindled, will then feed itself." End quote. This is partly the expression of an educational truth and an educational method, but it goes further. For the ultimate objective of the philosophic training is religious, and the language of the 7th letter and of the Republic is the language of religious experience. The vision of the form of the good is not entirely dissimilar to what others have called the vision of God. That is not to say that the form of the good and God are to be identified. They probably should not be, though scholars have disputed the point. But the experience is religious. It has the characteristics that William James noted in all mystical experiences. It is a state of knowledge, and yet incommunicable in ordinary language, and it is therefore appropriate that the Republic should end with a religious myth. For whatever Plato may have thought about the details of the myth, it is clear that it is intended to express in pictorial and poetic form the general philosophic and religious conviction of the Republic that the temporal is only the shadow of the eternal, and that the human soul is responsible not simply to itself but to God. And this will be the final part of the introduction. on society and politics as one of the main themes in the Republic. And there's still several pages to go. There's about 6 pages on that, so it's obviously an important part of the Republic, and then we will end for the evening. Society and politics. What Plato has to say on these topics can conveniently be considered under 3 headings: the class system, property and the family, and the philosopher-ruler. So we begin with the class system. Plato arrives at this from the principle that in any society men will group themselves according to their occupations. In the economic sphere you will get producers, merchants, traders, and so on. The economic structure of the society of which he was thinking and in which he lived is elementary, and he is thinking of occupations and not income groups. But the principle is clear enough. He goes on to apply it in the sphere of war and government. The armies of Greece in the 5th century were citizen armies, but the 4th century saw the rise of the professional soldier, and that may, in part, have suggested to Plato that his guardians, who first appear as a military group, should be specialists in war. But it soon appears that they are to perform the functions not only of soldiering, but also of government, and that they are subdivided into rulers, proper, and auxiliaries, who correspond roughly to government and army executive police, as opposed to the rest of the population who make up the 3rd class. Plato's 3 classes, in fact, are not so much 3 as 2, one of which is further subdivided. Many object at once to this division of society into 3 distinct classes, with a definite order of subordination between them. The words hierarchic society or caste system are used to describe it disapprovingly. Plato might reply that the quarrel is to some extent about words. Any society, he might say, is bound to show economic groupings. Few societies can do without their professional army, and in all societies someone has to give orders and someone obey, which means that in practice there will be a minority of people issuing orders or seeing they are obeyed, the government, and a majority obeying them, the rest. What people differ about is whether and to what extent these primary groupings should be complicated by further class divisions based on birth or wealth, and how the governmental minority should in fact be chosen. To Plato's views on these last 2 topics, which are what the objectors really dislike, we shall return. Meanwhile, it is important to see just what his 3 classes and their mutual relations are. About his 3rd class he does not tell us a great deal. They are not in any sense a proletariat or working class. They comprise all those engaged in economic activities, farmers, manufacturers, traders, rich or poor, for they are allowed to own property. Their function is to provide for the material and economic needs of the community. Their virtue is obedience, and it is pretty clear that they will be under strict control. The guardians will see that there is no excessive wealth and poverty among them, and will presumably direct and control all their activities, for they are the body of the governed whom the governing minority administers. The governing minority, the guardians, discharge between them primarily the functions of government and army, but that is, as already indicated, too narrowly imprecise a description. The function of the rulers is to govern, that is to say, to take all those decisions of policy which it is the business of government to take. The auxiliaries' function is to assist the rulers in the execution of their decisions, or to enforce the decisions of the rulers. We must think of them as combining the functions of civil service, military, and police, as being, that is, charged with the execution and implementation, if necessary by force, of government decision. And if we think of a society in which there is a government by full-time trained experts who are precluded by law from any other function, and who have a body of trained civil servants, together with the necessary police and military forces to assist them, we get some idea in modern terms of this part of Plato's proposals. The two top classes are, as we have seen, really subdivisions of a single class. They share the same way of life and are put through the same elaborate system of training and promotion outlined in Part 7. There are a large number of promotion bars to be passed, quite enough to grade the auxiliaries for their various functions, while leaving a small homogeneous ruler class to emerge at the top. But all have started with equal opportunities. The third class have no say in matters of government, but Plato constantly emphasizes that the rulers have their interests at heart. The difference between Timochy and the ideal is that in Timochy, oppression has replaced benevolent government, and the rulers govern with the willing consent of the governed. This relationship is set out in the foundation myth. Two further criticisms may be considered here. First, Aristotle's criticism that we are not in fact told nearly enough about the third class. And though Plato is deliberate in his avoidance of detail, it is difficult not to agree that the criticism is just. There are too many essential questions left unanswered. The second criticism is that Plato's guardians are a hereditary caste. The critic, of course, assumes that this is true, is itself a condemnation, but his interpretation is wrong. Plato emphatically asserts that promotion from the third class is not only possible, but an important feature of his scheme, just as demotion from the two upper classes is also. And in Book 8 we are told that it is a failure in this matter that leads to the change to Timochy. It is, of course, extremely hard to see how the scheme is to work, as Aristotle again remarks. Cornford suggests that all classes must share a common education up to the age of 18, in order that the rulers can promote and demote. Certainly the choice would have to be made by then, and this would be one way of making it, and would be in tune with Plato's views on the importance of education. But there is nothing in the text to suggest it, and we cannot speak with certainty. There is, however, no reason to doubt that Plato means what he says about promotion and demotion. The real point is that what he wants is an aristocracy of talent. He thinks, as we shall see, that we can get this largely by breeding, as one breeds racehorses. But the breeding process is not infallible, and so there must be provision for both promotion and demotion. There must be both snakes and ladders, even though we don't know exactly what the rules are to be. Belief in an aristocracy of talent may be wicked, but it is not the same as belief in a hereditary caste. Property and the family. This brings us to Plato's views on property and the family, and the provisions he makes under this head apply only to the two upper classes, the guardians. The third class, we presume, live under the normal arrangements, but among the guardians both private property and the family are to be abolished. Plato's dislike of both has one main cause. He thought that private interests and private affections distracted a man from his duties to the community, and both are centered in the family. As far as the abolition of private property is concerned, we have seen already how deeply he distrusted the desire for wealth as a social motive. He thought that it led to nothing but disunity, that pursuit of riches corrupted government and disrupted society, and that as a criterion of suitability for political power, they were worthless. He accordingly proposed to limit the differences of wealth in his third class very strictly, and by abolishing property altogether in his guardian class to eliminate the profit motive from political influence. On the abolition of private property among the guardians, Aristotle made comments that have become classic. You do not, he pointed out, necessarily get rid of evils by changing institutions. The fault may lie in human nature and not in the system of private property. The instinct to possess is natural and, provided it does not degenerate into selfishness, a source of proper pleasure, property which is common is apt to be treated not with the care given to something which is our own, but with the carelessness so often shown to what is other people's. The argument is on a simple level, but anticipates modern controversy between individualism and collectivism. Plato's reasons for abolishing the family are slightly more complex. He dislikes the distinction of family affections, but he has other reasons as well. He starts from the principle of the equality of the sexes. By this he means that, though men and women have different functions in the process of reproduction, they should, apart from that difference, follow the same careers, share the same education, and have the same opportunities. Women may not always be able to do quite such heavy or energetic work as men, as for example in war, but within the limitations imposed by their physique, equality is to be absolute. It follows logically that they must be exempted so far as possible from family responsibilities, for under the family system what stands in the way of the kind of sex equality which Plato wants is the domestic responsibility for running a household and bringing up a family. With complete logic, therefore, he removes that responsibility by abolishing the family and substituting for it a system of state nurseries. This has the further advantage that it makes possible the breeding of guardians on scientific lines. The production of children is a matter of such vital importance to the state that it is clearly undesirable to leave it to the unregulated operation of private enterprise and individual affection. This point of view comes out in the laws too. Plato therefore arranges for sexual intercourse to be strictly regulated and confined to certain regular marriage festivals, when suitable partners will be mated, with a view to producing the best type of guardian, just as one breeds dogs or racehorses. How about that? The details of Plato's arrangement may seem to us quite impracticable. Perhaps the best way to get them into proper perspective is to refer to the scheme to be found in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World on the channel, live read on the channel. There, children bearing has been abolished entirely, and babies are produced in laboratories where they are fitted by hereditary and subsequent conditioning for the different types of occupation required by the community. The physical relationship between men and women is reduced to a matter of private pleasure and shorn of its emotional implications. These arrangements would have seemed to Plato admirable. Under them, the whole business of the production and education of citizens becomes a matter of exact control and knowledge. Men and women can be put on a footing of complete equality, with the necessity for periodic childbearing, which still remained in the Republic, finally removed, and with the tiresome business of the physical relationship reduced to a minimum of importance. For Plato's attitude to the physical relationship seems to have been one of indifference, tempered by dislike. He knew the instinct as an unruly one, but he always ranked physical pleasures low and believed that unruly instincts were there to be restrained, though he recognized that the sex instinct, like others, must have its outlet, and his experience of emotional attachments between people appears to have been confined to friendships between men. Of love between the sexes, so far as we know, he had no experience, nor would he have valued it highly. In that he was, to some extent, no doubt, influenced by the lower status which women held in Greek society. This has been much exaggerated, and Professor Kitto has written on the subject with refreshing good sense, nor need we suppose that the kind of attachment between husband and wife to which Aristotle's will bears evidence was uncommon. Plato's attitude was more personal than typical Greek. Nevertheless, his desire for equality between the sexes was no doubt in part a protest against the very limited scope women were given in contemporary Athenian society. So far, most modern opinion would agree with him, and it may be said that his scheme looks forward to the greater freedom women enjoy in our own day, and perhaps anticipates the objectives of the women's liberation movement. Yet one may doubt the desirability or possibility of the exact similarity of role which Plato demanded. To sweep aside the physiological differences as unimportant and ignore the psychological differences they entail is to be in danger of ignoring women's special excellences. To free women to any extent from family ties is to free them to do other things. But if you merely expect them to do the same things as men, they are likely, as Plato in effect said, to end up as inferior men. Is it not better to recognize the difference rather than pretend it does not exist? From the more strictly eugenic standpoint, neither Plato's nor Aldous Huxley's proposals are very much like practical politics, but Plato might well point to our increasing knowledge of heredity as an indication that he was on the right lines, and look forward to the day when greater knowledge would give us greater control. How that control was exercised he would not much care, provided that it was used to breed better citizens, but he would certainly be interested by, and perhaps quote in his own justification, any evidence that there is a hereditary element in talent. In practice, however, he would have to agree that the family is not likely to disappear, and he retains it under strict supervision in the laws. But he is open to another, more general criticism. He assumes that family affections and loyalties can only be a source of weakness, that the good family man must be a worse citizen. Family loyalties can, of course, be distracting, but the assumption is an absurd one, though typical of Plato's love of uniformity. He could not see that the greater loyalty draws strength and force from the lesser which it contains, or his attempt to diffuse family and other loyalties and affections through the community could only lead, as Aristotle pointed out, to their dilution and weakening. He was unable, as Aristotle again said, to distinguish between unity and uniformity. And here we arrive at the last part about the philosopher ruler, which, as we learned earlier on in the introduction, is what the whole work of the Republic is about: to create philosopher kings, philosopher statesmen, philosopher rulers. And so here we'll learn a little bit more about it. The philosopher ruler. The philosopher ruler is the central theme of the Republic. It is the aim of its whole educational curriculum to produce him, and much that has already been said has dealt with him directly or by implication. At the end of the long course of training there is left a small class, how large we are not told, of those who have survived all tests and mastered the whole curriculum. They are the philosopher rulers. They represent the highest talent, are given the highest training, and are put at the disposal of the state. They do not serve the state because they want to. They are philosophers who have seen the supreme vision and would prefer to spend their time in philosophy. But they have a duty to their fellow men, and that they discharge by doing the work of government for which their training has fitted them. They are a dedicated minority, ruling in the interests of all. There is a perennial attraction in this conception of the highest talent put at the disposal of the community, of the ruler whose heart is in heaven, dedicating himself to the service of society. We should respect Plato's vision, but not forget its dangers. We may ask first, on the plane of a humdrum realism, whether the long course of abstract studies which Plato proposes is really the best training for dealing with men and affairs, and whether the method of selection he proposes, based largely on proficiency in abstract subjects, examinations in mathematics, science and philosophy up to the age of 35, is a sensible one. Is not this one of the fallacies to which educators are prone, the belief that people who do well in their courses will do well at everything, and that the longer they spend on them, the better they will do? Is not a wider curriculum and a lot more practical experience more likely to produce a better ruler? More important is the objection that government, by a self-perpetuating minority of experts, is in any case undesirable and in particular undemocratic. We have seen that recruits of the course, which begins at the age of 20, are drawn from all the classes, though the vast majority of them come from the top 2 because they are bred for the job. They are chosen by the rulers on their merits. There is no question of democratic election because, as we have seen, Plato thought that as bad as a way of choosing rulers as choosing them by their wealth. And before we dismiss Plato's scheme out of hand, we should remember the methods we use today for picking people for administrative and managerial training, the tests of character and ability applied by the civil service commissioners, for example, and reflect that those are the modern parallels to what he proposes. He is concerned to pick people for their competence for the job, and not for characteristics such as wealth or persuasiveness that have no necessary connection with that competence. Indeed, he might well at this point put some questions to us. He would remind us that society today is infinitely more complicated than it was in his day. He would ask us how we think this increasingly complicated structure is to be administered, if not by men and women who have the character and competence needed. He would then point out that the amount of ability available in any community is limited, and perhaps quote modern statistics in support of this. And if men are not equal in talent and abilities, surely no society can afford to work on the assumption that they are, least of all modern society. Must we not do our best to ensure that the available talent is most profitably employed, that difference of talent were recognized and the highest talent put to the best use? Which brings you back, he might conclude, to the philosopher ruler. For as we have seen, what Plato wanted was an aristocracy of talent, and we must see the principles behind his detail. And if we want a modern brief description of his kind of society, managerial meritocracy is perhaps the nearest we can get. It emphasizes the need for qualifications and competence in government, though it leaves out many of the other elements in the Platonic solution. More fatal is the objection that the conception of a philosopher ruler encourages us to look for a degree of knowledge and integrity which are in fact not to be found. The knowledge of all human beings is limited, and for any group of them to think that they have the key to all human problems is presumptuous and absurd. But that is what the philosopher ruler is supposed to have, and certain types of doctrinaire are liable to a similar illusion. Yet to put the government of human affairs into the hands of any class of supposed experts is to ask from them more than they can possibly give. And quite apart from limitations of knowledge, there is the moral problem. Power is a corrupting influence, a corruption which few can resist, and on the whole political leaders are not men of more than average moral integrity. We are perhaps lucky if they are as good as that. It is better to act on that assumption and to limit power lest it should be abused than to look for the perfect ruler who needs no such limitation. The argument against Plato's system, in fact, is not that it trusts the common man too little, but that it trusts its rulers too much. And that, guys, was a rather detailed and in-depth introduction, thanks to Desmond Lee, from this Penguin Classic edition of the Republic, and that's really set things up, although it might have been a bit hard going for many of us, and sort of very what's the word, my brain stopped working, very, nope, it's not coming, very bookish, very I can't think of the word. Anyway, it was quite dense, but it set the upcoming study nicely. And so we've learned a lot about the topics that are covered, what we're likely to find, the main themes, where Plato was when he wrote the Republic. And so next week, Thursday at 8 p.m, we'll be working through Book 1, like I say, Hackett Publishing as the source text, but with summary and introductory remarks from the Penguin Classic version, so it will be very, very accessible, very interesting to have the introductory remarks and then move into the dialogue. So I'm very excited to share that with you guys. I hope you've enjoyed the introduction, albeit very dense, and no, still can't think of the words. So for now, I'll say good night. Coming up at the weekend, Sunday, we have Enid Blyton, The Adventures of the Wishing Chair, and Monday, Albert Camus' The Fall, two very different book genres, but here at Book Club, we cater to all, so I'm looking forward to those as well. And Plato's Republic Book 1 will be next Thursday. But for now, guys, have a great weekend, and hopefully I'll see you Sunday evening for Enid Blyton. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, MM, and I hope to see you next week, Thursday, for book 1. Okay, guys, take care. I'll see you soon.